this evening. We greatly appreciate it. I've been wanting Roger, and he's been wanting to come to Amman for a long time, and I'm absolutely delighted that he is here. And I'm so sorry that it is on such a ominous evening. I mean, today I think the world is all going mad. I think that's probably an understatement. And this afternoon, also with news about Jordan locking down. The airport, I think, is going to be closed as of Tuesday, right? Is that confirmed? Yeah, no flights at all, and schools are going to be closed down, and it's rainy and foggy, but here we are. So I think that's a huge testament to the appeal that you have here, Roger. People read you, and people admire you, and people want to hear what you have to say. And I think the title of Roger's talk tonight, okay, not to mention also the problem we have with the auditorium, right? So that adds another level to everything. Anyway, Roger's talk is Adieu, Middle East, the consequences of American abdication. It goes without saying that this talk comes at an especially important and poignant moment, even without what's going on with COVID-19. And maybe Roger can talk a little bit about sort of what this says about leadership or lack thereof, not only in the United States, but around the world. But if we look at US foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East, and we examine it over the past couple of decades to 3 decades, we see that there have been dramatic, sometimes really unpredictable moves and shifts. We've gone from the Bush administration's aggressive unilateralism to Obama's focus on diplomacy and multilateral engagement, and now to the impulsive and unbalanced foreign policy of Donald Trump. A common theme, though, that connects all of these is unpredictability. And this has only increased since Donald Trump was elected president. From his so-called deal of the century to the sudden withdrawal of US troops from northern Syria last October, US engagement in the region under Trump has alternated between farce and tragedy. As much as the situation has become more dangerous and unstable under President Trump, the complexities of the Arab world are a challenge for even the best-intentioned policymakers. Take, for example, President Obama's pursuit of a nuclear agreement with Iran. Although experts generally agree that the JCPOA made the region safer, a range of factors, including pressure from a number of Middle Eastern governments, ultimately succeeded in pressuring Trump to withdraw from the deal. If we look at the legacy of the US invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, that although in hindsight it seems obvious that these were egregious mistakes, what's the right approach now for US policymakers? Is it total disengagement or is it something else? If we look at the Arab Spring and the subsequent protest movements that we see today in Algeria, Lebanon, Iraq, Sudan, and elsewhere, what's been referred to as part 2 of the Arab Spring, what should the US do? Should it support popular protest movements for freedom and democracy, or turn its back on allies and autocratic regimes, or maybe do nothing at all? It's very difficult to answer questions like these, if not impossible. To talk about geopolitical developments in the region in the right way requires tremendous nuance, courage, understanding, and humility. These are attributes that most Western pundits, in my opinion, lack today. But without question, Roger Cohen is an exception. Roger has worked for the New York Times for 30 years as a foreign correspondent, foreign editor, and now columnist. Prior to that, he worked for the Wall Street Journal and for Reuters. He's the author of 4 books. The latest is a family memoir entitled The Girl from Human Street, Ghosts of Memory in a Jewish Family. The book was published to wide acclaim by Alfred Kotnoff in January of 2015. Roger has taught at Harvard and Princeton, and his work has been recognized with several awards, including a Lifetime Achievement Award from Britain's Next Century Foundation, a prize from the Overseas Press Club of New York, and in 2017, he was awarded the Society of Publishers in Asia Prize for opinion writing for a series he wrote on Australian mistreatment of refugees. And he won the same award again in 2018 for a piece about the Rohingya crisis in Burma. Roger was raised in South Africa and in England, and he is a graduate of Balliol College, Oxford University. Please join me in welcoming Roger Cohen to the podium.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much, Safwan. Thank you for this invitation, and very happy to be here. Again, echoing Safwan, thank you all so much for coming out this evening to be here. Even the weather is apocalyptic. And even in the space of the 4 days I've been here, at a dinner at Safwan's 3 nights ago, everybody was hugging and shaking hands and behaving like normal human beings. And now, last night, the first thing upon entry was, of course, some kind of disinfectant for one's hands, and everybody was either namaste or elbow or whatever the new social rights are. Well, it's very good to be back here in Jordan. Getting here was easy. The airports and the planes were empty. And of course, one thing about the coronavirus is that people are worrying less about the Middle East. They have other things on their minds. We'll see about getting home. I may be in Jordan for a long time. One thing about COVID-19 is it reorders our thoughts. We start to wonder which parts of the frenzy of modern life are really necessary. We appreciate bonds of friendship and love with greater intensity. We recognize that what we share, vulnerability, is greater than what separates us. We are pushed out of the near autistic contemplation of our devices to the realization that the smallest physical gesture, a handshake, for example, may impact the life of another human being. We are perhaps reminded of Voltaire's wise words at the conclusion of Candide, il faut cultiver son jardin. We're facing 2 threats. A serious new virus originating in China is the first. The second is mass hysteria. Perhaps the second is more dangerous. The events of recent weeks are a reminder of how quickly the world can lurch into panic, how hard it can be to think for yourself. Less than 2 months ago, there was a different focus of anxiety. The United States almost went to war with Iran. Remember that? It's hard to recall things these days, such as the cascade of events and the bombardment of social media. The immediate cause of the near war with Iran was President Donald Trump's order to kill General Qasem Soleimani, the ruthless chief architect of Iran's regional expansion. Whatever you think of Soleimani, and I think he did a lot of harm, this was an impetuous decision, an extrajudicial murder whose consequences might have been devastating. Now, I am reluctant to say this as an American patriot. I'm a naturalized American. I became a citizen 15 years ago, and perhaps as a result of that, I'm still starry-eyed in some ways about the America I believe in. So I'm reluctant to say this as an American patriot, but I must say it because I'm an American patriot. My president is not somebody who thinks things through. He does not read history. He is skeptical of science. He is not curious. He relies on his hunches, even about the coronavirus. His attention span is short. His ego is large. His hair is mysterious. His relationship with truth is flimsy to non-existent. He does not listen. He is unserious. Watching Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada yesterday explain his decision to self-isolate after his wife's diagnosis of infection, I experienced with a kind of shock what it is to perceive a leader of decency and rational intelligence. This, for an American, has become an unfamiliar feeling. My subject today is Adieu, Middle East, the consequences of American abdication. It might also have been Adieu, a certain America. I'm referring to the United States of the post-1945 era, the underwriter of global security, the country that, yes, made many mistakes, as nations do, as individuals do, but held fast to certain values: liberty, the rule of law, representative government, a free press, human rights, a rules-based international order, defense of its allies. The America that opposed tyrants and favored the spread of freedom. The America whose word was worth something. The America whose seriousness of purpose led to the Jordan-Israel peace treaty of a quarter century ago. The America that I cherish, the America symbolized by this very institution where we meet today, a place of openness, dialogue, stimulating disagreement, debate, and constant evolution. The United States is an idea, or it is nothing. That America is under threat right now. Whether it can be revived in any form is an open question. It may be that adieu in the end proves to be au revoir. I am not holding my breath. Now, I'm aware that the view of the United States that I've just expressed may not be widely shared in the Middle East or even in this room. The American orchestrated coup in Iran in 1953, the embrace of dictators in the pursuance of oil interests, the favoring of Israel over Palestine, the disastrous Iraq War, and equally disastrous inaction in Syria are just a few instances of the kinds of policy decisions that have persuaded many people in this region that American foreign policy is more of an exercise in hypocrisy than honor. Donald Trump's so-called peace plan for Israel-Palestine, made public in January, was the ne plus ultra of insulting American irresponsibility. Against that view, I would suggest a couple of things. The tendency to blame America as a convenient escape from responsibility is a region-wide reflex in the Middle East, at least in my experience. Conspiracy theories that attribute to the CIA fantastic forms of omniscience are also exercises in evasion. The United States' role in the Egyptian and Jordanian peace treaties with Israel was critical. Absent Rabin's assassination, I believe an American-backed two-state peace might have been achieved a quarter century ago. If the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, a fragile entity, has survived and become an island of relative stability in the region, I think it's because the United States has stood by it, providing well over $1 billion a year in aid, as well as military, intelligence, and other support. In the end, the question for everybody is, has the United States overall been a force for good or ill in the world? I'm sure everyone in this room has a different opinion on that. Personally, I do not hesitate to say good. President Trump, however, has bulldozed the America I believe in. His policies constitute a radical rupture, as Safwan suggested, not a continuation. During his presidency, the United States has walked away from serious as opposed to frivolous involvement in the Middle East. Other actors, notably President Vladimir Putin of Russia, have stepped into the vacuum. The inherent instability of unresolved conflicts and inadequate political systems across the region has been exacerbated by this American abandonment of its values and of its allies. A young population's thirst for change across the Middle East in the direction of greater agency and economic opportunity, away from cronyism and nepotism and corruption, remains strong. Where an older generation sees inevitable division and sectarianism, the young people I met in the streets of Beirut a few months ago see shared humanity, the fragility of the planet, the bonds that unite irrespective of race, gender, religion, or sexual orientation. Uprisings from Beirut to Baghdad at the end of the last year were a kind of Arab Spring redux. But the one-time advocate of more open and accountable Middle Eastern societies, the United States, has gone AWOL. Syria and Yemen and Libya fester. Refugees continue to flee Syria a dismembered country that is a stain on humanity's conscience. Turkey threatens to weaponize these refugees by sending them on to a Europe that does not want them. Whatever hopes there were of drawing Iran closer to the world at last through the Iran nuclear deal have been shattered. The Islamic Republic's radicalism will only be exacerbated by further isolation. The nuclear deal was not perfect. Of course it wasn't. What in life is? In a deal, something that's forgotten in the world today, you normally get at most 70% of what you want. Today everyone wants 100%. How can you possibly make a deal on that basis? When in life do you get more than 70% of what you want? It served a purpose, and it was a potential bridge. President Trump blew up that bridge rather than build out from it, a serious error. If the world was concerned about Iran's development of missile technology, why did it have to tackle it by abrogating the nuclear accord? That makes no sense. Keep what you have and then build out from it. Try to tackle the issues that are still worrying. Mohammed bin Salman's erratic rule in Saudi Arabia, and erratic is a kind adjective, most recently manifested in the arrest of several princes and an oil price war with Russia, causes havoc. Yet President Trump has been an enthusiastic supporter of MBS, abandoning any search for an American policy that involved Saudi-Iranian balancing. In fact, in general, balance, like science or multilateralism, is not a word this president or this administration likes. He abhors the word balance. America's uncritical embrace of MBS persisted through the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi columnist for the Washington Post and critic of the House of Saud. The message to dictators around the world was clear. Do what you like. The United States will not stand in your way. Leaders from Putin to Duterte drew their conclusions. For them, President Donald Trump is an enabler. Human rights are not part of the president's lexicon. That Trump would not stand with a murdered journalist working for a major American paper was consistent with his oft-expressed view that the press is the enemy of the people. Now that, as you know, is a phrase of pure totalitarian pedigree. It was used by Mao, it was used by Stalin. The Trump administration does not care. Authoritarian ascendancy is directly tied to American abdication. In fact, Trump's words at his press conference yesterday on the coronavirus, I don't take responsibility at all. I don't take responsibility at all. This is the President of the United States speaking. Sum up this presidency. The buck stops nowhere. It disappears into a swamp of incompetence. I don't take responsibility at all. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, that is where we are. I used the word frivolous earlier. What other term is appropriate for the so-called Trump peace plan for Israel-Palestine? The deal of the century to the president, the slap of the century for Mahmoud Abbas, and most accurately, in my view, the farce of the century. The words the plan has written all over it are, I don't take responsibility at all. It is profoundly unserious. In essence, the proposal reflects the administration's contempt for the cause of Palestinian nationhood and a two-state outcome, and its uncritical support for Israeli goals of annexation and rule over the whole area from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River. In formulating it, Jared Kushner, the president's languid son-in-law, made no serious attempt at mediation. He seemed to place his faith in the ability of the Saudis and Emiratis to buy out Palestinians' quest for statehood with a few $1 billion, a total misjudgment. This, as everyone here knows, is not about money. It's about Palestinian dignity. As with the earlier transfer of the American embassy to Jerusalem, the Trump administration failed to engage in serious consultation with one of the prime interested parties, Jordan. In fact, Jordan is an important example of an American ally whose counsel and interests have been marginalized by President Trump. King Abdullah has shown considerable restraint. His commitment to a two-state peace is well known. No wonder I hear he is not enthusiastic these days about finding himself in the same room as the president. Who knows what, at any moment, President Trump might blurt out. In a conversation the other day here in Amman, your Prime Minister, Omar Azaz, told me, a deal involves two parties. You cannot give one party the benefits immediately and say to the other, perhaps in 40 years you will maybe see some benefits. It is just a farce. One party gets everything at once and the other gets the optics of pretending you care about them. Kushner, however, did not care just how insulting his plan is to the Palestinians. Since the announcement of the plan in January, we've heard little of it. This is consistent with President Trump's transformation of politics into theater. Great fanfare accompanies an event, say the president's peacemaking meeting in Singapore with President Kim Jong-un of North Korea. It then transpires that nothing of substance has been accomplished. People move on, there's a barrage of new tweets from Trump, and the whole thing fades into the mists of time. Such irresponsibility has consequences. The peace plan effectively gives Israel carte blanche to annex the Jordan Valley and existing settlements. That would be a disaster. Israeli politics are in flux, but the fact that the United States has reversed itself on fundamental principles of any two-state peace is profoundly damaging. The possibility of resolving the conflict feels more distant than ever, until a new generation of leaders comes along in Washington, Jerusalem, and Ramallah. I fear the best we can hope for is the avoidance of another war. For me, an American Jew, the idea of Israeli statehood built on the statelessness and humiliation of another people, the Palestinians, is an unacceptable outcome, pregnant always with further violence. For decades now, I've been a strong supporter of efforts to forge a two-state peace, allowing Palestinians and Israelis to live side by side in peace and security. And as I said at the time of Rabin, I do think that we were within range of achieving that goal. Of course, it was not inevitable. You can't prove anything with hypotheticals in history. Nevertheless, I think we can say that this was perhaps the most effective assassination in history. The assassination of the Israeli leader who had developed a relationship with Yasser Arafat, who wanted to make peace, who had fought the wars and battles and concluded that there was no way to continue as Israel has continued over recent decades. Without that assassination, I think there was a possibility of getting there. But this assassination removed that possibility, and over the last quarter century, of course, the likelihood of achieving that peace has receded radically. And you will say to me, is this not just a pipe dream now? Has the 53-year occupation not gone too far? Does the fact that only five Jewish members of the 120-member Knesset are even willing now to use the word occupation, does that not demonstrate that Israelis, in their vast majority, believe all the land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River is theirs? Is the presence of hundreds of thousands of settlers not an insurmountable obstacle? How much more evidence do you need to pronounce Oslo a cadaver beyond resuscitation? But the other question, of course, is, what is the alternative? One state, one state, one state. It has become fashionable to dream of a kind of United States of Jews and Palestinians in the Holy Land, as if a country in which a certain date for half the population is a day of liberation, and for the other half, a day of catastrophe, is not problematic, as if terrible history can be wished away overnight, as if such a country could ever agree on a school textbook, as if Jews who dreamed for millennia of their own homeland will suddenly concede this was misguided and believe once more, the Holocaust notwithstanding, in the kindness of strangers. As if the Middle East offers multiple credible examples of harmonious coexistence between different national and religious groups, and God knows, Jordan knows something about that, as if it's enough to dream and all will be well. Which dream is more outrageous, 2 states or 1? That's a tough call as I speak. There remains the reality of the status quo with its false implication of immobility. Prime Minister Netanyahu's sinister political genius has been to use the so-called status quo over a decade and a half to advance the destruction of the idea of Palestinian statehood. Now the question for Israel is simple. Does it really want to be an apartheid state? If it does not, it cannot continue with its current policies. The question for Palestinians, it seems to me, is this: has the time not come to blow up a so-called status quo that day by day undermines the goal of Palestinian statehood? The Palestinian National Authority is the symbol of this iniquitous situation. A supposedly interim form of self-government, it has become the deeply corrupt agent of Palestinian emasculation and complicity in Israel's designs. No election has been held in a decade and a half. It is not enough to blame the occupation, devastating as it is. The case for the dissolution of the authority, of the PA, seems to me increasingly compelling. At the very least, it would oblige Israel to think again. If the peace process is fictive, so too is the PA. That's just logic, right? Better then to be done with it. After World War II, France and Germany did not decide to abolish their borders. What they did decide, however, was to set out on a path that would make those borders meaningless. To me, in Israel-Palestine, that path of peace still begins with 2 states. Their borders, over time, in such a small physical space, would ultimately dissolve to the point of meaninglessness. However, it is easier today to predict a 3rd intifada or another war on the Lebanese border or another eruption in Gaza than it is to see such an outcome. Still, I refuse to give up. A millennial generation in the Middle East deserves better. It's sick of frozen conflicts and political systems. Neither the oppression of dictators nor the promises of Islamic radicalism have delivered the human dignity that comes with more transparent governance, free election, the rule of law, and peace. If the Enlightenment and Islam have had such difficulty in finding some political reconciliation, if that has been so elusive in this region, I don't think that is cause to give up, to think that some Western ideas of politics and the presence of Islam in this region are irreconcilable. I do not believe they are. To me, Jordan offers some perspective. It's a reminder that history is flux. It is movement. History is movement. It is the mixing of blood and cultures. Up at the citadel here in Amman, we see things the Romans built and the Arabs adapted and the British used. We see objects that are pagan or Christian or Muslim. Nationalism is an attempt to deny all this, and we live in an age of resurgent nationalism. Nationalism is an attempt to set nation against nation. That's what we see with Bolsonaro, with Modi, with Xi Jinping, with Putin, with Duterte, and with my own president. It is the most powerful idea on earth, and its end point is war. The 21st century, to resist the fate of the 20th, must reject nationalism, which, in contrast to patriotism, turns the otherness of the stranger into the galvanizing focal point of a violent appeal. Trump like Netanyahu, has not hesitated to do this. As Rudyard Kipling observed more than a century ago, all good people agree, and all good people say, all nice people like us are we, and everyone else is they. We will not forge a better future, nor beat this virus, if we side with our baser instincts. I recall a little museum at the Citadel here, neglected, a little random, like the way our thoughts flit, a skull amid jugs, glass vases, colorful bracelets, cooking vessels. Life has changed less than we think. Because the museum is a little chaotic, I felt my thoughts able to roam free. I imagined how people use those objects and in what settings. One problem with technology is that it crowds out the imagination. I love the Jordanian desert too. The desert frees me. Its vastness is a good yardstick for the significance of Twitter shrieking. Wander out into it and things fall into perspective. We're not here for that long. May as well use the time we have. I love the distant horizon, the subtle undulations, and the timelessness. Near the border here, I once saw a large Syrian refugee camp. How hot it must be in summer. How devastating not to belong. How painful the loss of home. How easy to forget the Syrian tragedy and overlook the fact that these people did not leave by choice. They left because they ran out of choices. I guess, looking back in my work over decades now, I've been driven by the fragile idea that I could make a difference, that words might help end a war, or ease the fate of refugees, or save a man on death row, or deliver a homeless people to the dignity of statehood, in some small way. More often than not, of course, that is not the case. Still, I've been afflicted, for better or worse, with a defiant optimism. You know, ladies and gentlemen, my parents were South Africans who left Johannesburg when I was 2 because they could not abide apartheid. My father, in fact, was the dean of the last residency at Witwatersrand University that was admitting black students. And when that was shut down by the nationalist government, he said, okay, that's enough, we're out of here. So I grew up surrounded by the inevitability of cataclysm. Each year I would arrive from London in Johannesburg, and my cousins would advise me to enjoy the swimming pools of family homes, because next year they would be red with blood. The blacks, banished to the horizon, banished to the fetid townships, abused through an evil system designed to strip them of their humanity, would rise up to claim what was theirs, and the 4 million whites of South Africa would flee. You know what? It did not happen. It didn't happen because of forgotten words like statesmanship and leadership. The leadership of Mandela and de Klerk, who understood that even an agonizing compromise was better than the bloodshed of children. And that's what, in Israel-Palestine, we've never quite reached, the realization that an agonizing compromise, because any compromise there will inevitably be absolutely agonizing, is better than the bloodshed of children. The worst is not inevitable. Let me say in conclusion, let me urge you not to abandon hope. Life is the unexpected. Who foresaw this virus, or the fall of the Berlin Wall, or the collapse of the Soviet Imperium, or the spread of freedom to hundreds of millions of people during my lifetime in Central Europe, in Asia, in South America? Who foresaw the Arab Spring? Nobody. The thing about spring is that it does return. I'm going to conclude with a couple of poems. The first, set in Jerusalem, perhaps you know it, is from the Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai. And it takes place in Jerusalem by the Old City. A group of tourists was standing around their guide, and I became their target maker. You see that man with the baskets? Just right of his head, there's an arch from the Roman period, just to the right of his head. But he's moving. I said to myself, redemption will only come if their guide tells them, you see that arch from the Roman period? It's not important. But next to it, left and down a bit, there sits a man who bought fruit and vegetables for his family. It's not the ancient arch that counts, however beautiful. It's food for our children and the peace to enjoy it. History is there to be studied, learned from, and when necessary, overcome. And I'll conclude with lines from 1939, a poem by W.H. Auden, set in my home, New York City, and written on the eve of World War II in another moment of ominous threat and cataclysmic fog and spreading fear. Here's Auden. I sit in one of the dives on 52nd Street, uncertain and afraid, as the clever hopes expire of a low, dishonest decade. Waves of anger and fear circulate over the bright and darkened lands of the earth, obsessing our private lives. The unmentionable odor of death offends the September night. Accurate scholarship can unearth the whole offense, from Luther until now, that has driven a culture mad. Find what occurred at Linz, what huge imago made a psychopathic God. I and the public know what all school children learn. Those to whom evil is done do evil in return. Exiled Thucydides knew all that a speech can say about democracy, and what dictators do, the elderly rubbish they talk to an apathetic grave. Analyzed all in his book, the enlightenment driven away, the habit-forming pain, mismanagement and grief. We must suffer them all again. And the poem ends with this verse. Defenseless under the night, our world in stupor lies, yet dotted everywhere, ironic points of light flash out wherever the just exchange their messages. May I, composed like them of eros and of dust, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, show an affirming flame. So read poetry, ladies and gentlemen. Recognize the elderly rubbish of dictators. Be such an affirming flame. Cultivate your garden. Work hard. Believe in the unimaginable. Together we will do it. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take questions. So.
Do we have a standing microphone?
I think there's one here.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Are we going to have a stand for it? No. Okay. Okay. So what we do? Okay. You'll hold it. Thank you so much. Okay.
There
so
are
we don't keep passing it from one person to the other. You'll be our stand, and for that we're very grateful.
For people in the door, there are a couple of seats here. Hello?
Yes.
Hello?
Okay.
There are seats here if you'd like to sit down. Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, and in the front.
If you don't mind, if you can come up to the microphone. We don't want to pass the microphone around. So if you don't mind, get up, come here, ask your question, and let's make sure it's a question. And be sincere. Thank you. Okay. Who wants to go first? Okay. Sami? لا أنا قصدي إنه ما بدناش pass it. Okay. So Sami, you're gonna be stuck with it. You hold it.
وين بروح؟
طب خلاص. Okay. Fine. Okay.
I just want to start by being the devil's advocate just to make it a little bit more interesting.
Sure.
Believe it or not, I'm going to defend Donald Trump. You started by saying talking about the perspective of the Middle East, how people see things a little bit different, and then you said, but they overdo it by blaming the CIA, blah blah blah. Established. The other part of this perspective that you probably did not touch on. In practical life, we don't see much difference between a nutcase like Donald Trump and a credible guy like Obama. The settlements were going on. Everything that Israel was doing then is doing now. It's only a statement that he made. Maybe, okay, he's going to move the embassy to Jerusalem. In contrast, when Saddam Hussein took over Kuwait, it was within 2 months that things were changing on the ground. So in real life, the only point that I heard about the embassy thing, for example, or the annexation of the Jordan Valley, is that once it becomes legal in Israel, you cannot go back, or it's not easy. And I don't think that's a big problem, because Rabin also discussed Jerusalem, and he discussed the Golan Heights when there was an Israeli decision. My question to you is it really that much difference just to attack Donald Trump and say him and his son-in-law and so on are the problem, or the problem is it much bigger with American policy?
You specifically on Israel-Palestine, is it much different,
Yes.
or not Middle East wide?
Well, we can go to
I mean,
that.
I think,
I
think
but this is a good
region-wide,
example.
I think President Obama did the right. I've thought for a long time that the way to deal with Iran is not to isolate it, and that here you have a highly sophisticated society that is largely estranged from the Islamic Republic, from the regime, and the more contacts there are with the West, the greater likelihood there is eventually that these people will rise to power. So I think on Iran, on Syria, on some other things, there are very clear differences. I take your point. However, I would argue that, and I agree, that Obama on Israel-Palestine in the end was a disappointment. He only at the very end, when he was on the way out, did he condemn, did the United States vote in the United Nations to condemn the expansion of the settlements. He did it when it was too late in his presidency to make a difference. So I think he should have said that. Perhaps if he'd said that, had the courage to do that at the beginning. And it's the usual calculus, American politics, what will it do if I take a position like this, to the funding for the Democratic Party, to, what happens in swing states like Florida, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, AIPAC. Nevertheless, I do think that the fact that this administration has moved the embassy to Jerusalem, has said to the Israeli government, annex the Golan Heights, fine. Annex the Jordan Valley, fine. Annex the settlements, fine. Fine by us. That to me is different from, in a significant way, from trying at least to hold the line in order to preserve the albeit faint possibility of some subsequent negotiation. We don't know. We don't know if if Abu Mazen is going to have a heart attack tomorrow. We don't know if it is conceivable in Israel that the ever stronger Israeli Arab parties could be part of a government in terms of offering external support to that government. We don't know. Will Netanyahu be gone soon? We don't know the answer to these questions. But once you give way on certain principles, such as no annexation in the West Bank, no annexation of Jordan. So to me, while taking your point that I'm sure people here, take a very jaundiced view at this point of whatever the United States might do on Israel-Palestine, because,
maybe the title of this lecture or the talk would be better if we say the consequences of American hijacking instead of abdication, because it's already hijacking the Palestinian cause. And going back to your lecture, you spoke about the coup supported by the United States CIA in 1953 in Iran.
yeah.
We here believe that it's not only that. The United States did not receive the Shah when he wanted to find a refuge there in 1979. We believe that the United States made a series of coups along the Middle East that shook it and made it like hell to live in over the past 50 years. We're talking about 1958 in Iraq, 1969 in Libya. We're talking about even 1952 in Egypt. I want to ask you a question about one of your appearances in 2012. You said that you don't believe the Arab Spring then was fading, and that it was taking place and materializing fast, and that it was possible to reconcile the Islamic movement with the Arab societies. Do you still hold this belief?
Thank you very much. Well, one of the things about being a columnist for the New York Times is when you're wrong very publicly. And yeah, I was wrong. I was wrong. I'd been in Tahrir Square, I'd been in Benghazi, I'd been in Tunis, and I really believed at the time that Middle Eastern societies were coming out of the refrigerator in which they had been confined, and that a new generation across the Arab world was insisting on agency in its lives, and on more representative government, on more openness, on an end to rule for 20, 30 years by the same man, always a man, by members who then passes on power to another member of the family, the Assads in Syria, and so on. And Mubarak had gone. Egypt is 25% of the Arab world. I really thought that Egypt could find some kind of middle way. And again, I was wrong. I mean, I had a lot of liberal friends in Tahrir Square who were for the ousting of Hosni Mubarak. When I went back a year later or a year and a half later and Morsi was in power, they were saying, no, we have to have a coup. I said, what do you mean we have to have a coup? You know, democracy doesn't work like that. I thought you wanted a more democratic society. Democracy, you throw the bums out after 4 years if you don't like them, as I hope we will do in November in the United States. You know, you don't just stumble from coup to coup, to use your, no, we have to do this. And of course, that Egyptian election, which was won, I think, with 51.8% of the vote, was it, or 52% of the vote, something like that. How often in the Middle East do you get an election won by that? Normally it's 99.9% or 98.7%. So this election in itself was important, and you had the Egyptian military swearing allegiance to a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, how incredible was this? How incredible and potentially groundbreaking was this? So I was wrong. You know, I think the liberal center, if you like, I'm not quite sure how to refer to it, is extremely weak in most Middle Eastern societies. I think the traditions that that are present here in this room, of give and take, of disagreement, of creative disagreement, of the need to find mechanisms in society through which differences can be mediated, rather than through direct confrontation, military confrontation often, finding a way out of the alternation, and you went through the history a little, of despotic secular or quasi-secular rule and the Islamists. Only Tunisia, a subject dear to Safwan, only Tunisia really in this Arab Spring does seem to have altered course, to have found some, pardon? Painstakingly, to have found some middle way. So yes, I was wrong about that. I don't think I was wrong about the fundamental urge. I was very struck in Beirut when I was there in November, I think it was, or December. I was very struck by how similar the things I was hearing in the streets were to what I'd heard, 8, 9 years previously. I mean, people don't want to have some connection with some minister in order to get water in their apartment. If you pay for a service, the state should provide the service. Why do swathes of Beirut stink? Because garbage is uncollected. Why can people not go to the beach? Because there's open sewage. Why does government have to be divided up along strict sectarian lines? I don't think the young Lebanese people, whether they're from Tripoli or Nabatea or or Tyre in the south. I don't think Christian, Shia, Druze, you name it. I think they have more shared ideas in the younger generation than not. So I don't think I was wrong about this urge. I was wrong about its capacity to find political realization. And of course, the Saudis and the Emiratis and everyone else poured billions and billions of dollars into sabotaging the urges and desires of young people across this region. And I think that was tragic. Yeah.
Yeah, no. My voice carries, but I'll...
No, but it's for the recording.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Very, obviously, very articulate lecture. My big question is, where is this region going from a 50-year perspective? Because if you look at the world, if you step back and you look at the world, you can see some broad strokes. You can see China rising. You can see India following, young population, huge population. You can see the U.S. continue to be economic and military power. But you get a sense that, broadly speaking, every region in the world is moving in a positive direction. If you looked at the 60s...
Perhaps not right this minute.
Right. Well, no. So yeah, sure. And there are hiccups everywhere. But you look.
I hope this is a hiccup.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully, we'll get over it.
Yeah.
So you see Europe kind of coalescing around the EU, even with a hiccup like Brexit. You can see, Latin America, which in the 60s was all dictatorship, moving in a direction. The only part of the world that always feels like it's hard to have a sense, a vision of where it's going on a 50-year basis is here. So where do you think it's going on a 50-year basis, this region?
Well, my crystal ball is probably like yours and everyone else's for this region. It's just like the weather outside. It's very foggy. And what characterizes the region, I think, and that's implicit in your question, is this huge degree of unpredictability. I mean, will the Islamic Republic, to take one obvious, massive question, will the Islamic Republic be around in 50 years? Will this, the only member of the 20 largest economies in the world that is not integrated with the global economy, a highly sophisticated, highly educated society of 85 million people, a real country with real borders that's been around for 5,000 years, will it join the world? Will this curious situation of a series of quasi-representative institutions like the Majlis or the presidency, with then sitting on top of it the Velayat-e-Faqih, the supreme leader who's standing in for the hidden imam who disappeared 1,100 years ago? Can you really, in a society, have this combination of the religio-mystical authoritarianism with this veneer of democratic institutions, and most Iranians under 35, and that's 65% of the population, would like to see the Velayat-e-Faqih become more of a symbolic office while society changes and evolves. So that, I think, is one massive question. Another, of course, is Israel-Palestine. We don't know. On the basis of the evidence to date, empirically, one has to be pessimistic. But again, as I said in my talk, very unexpected things can happen very quickly. And we don't know. I mean, I don't know. Syria, this dismembered country, it's there, right? And it's already had a huge impact on the world, not least in Europe, where I think the arrival of a couple of million refugees had a lot to do with Britain leaving the European Union, which I think is much more than a hiccup, by the way. I mean, to me, it's a huge disaster that I take very personally. So, and it's not, it's not for the next 5 weeks, or it's forever. I mean, hopefully, Donald Trump will be gone. You see, I mean, you look at Dubai, or even you look at Jordan. You do see, and social networking, all the communications that you have across the rest of the world. You have it here, and there are all kinds of networks that don't exist at the level of government, which is often negative in this region, and those networks can be very positive offsetting forces. So I think one just has to say, Saudi, House of Saud. I mean, this MBS is a very wild, erratic guy, and two princes just got arrested. I mean, the United States doesn't need Saudi as much as it did, not at all. The United States is self-sufficient in oil, so does it survive? Maybe, probably, maybe not. So again, I certainly can't make a 50-year, let alone a 5-year prediction. But it's certainly, I think, the most concerning and combustible part of the world today. Anyone else?
Is it Beirut?
Pardon?
In 50 years, we know Abu Mazen will still be there.
That's a safe prediction.
I have another question.
I think you also have.
Iraq and Afghanistan.
Sorry.
Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Now we have an agreement between the United States and Taliban.
Right.
And everybody knows that the United States went into Afghanistan in 2021 to break the Taliban and to crush the radical groups there. Iraq 2003, the invasion of Iraq, and Bremer, when he came in. We have huge question marks about the intention of the United States. The dismantling of the Ba'ath Party, the dismantling of the army, dismantling of the security, all led to the destruction of Iraq until now and beyond. All this, Afghanistan, Iraq, the tight lid, or the turning the eye to what's happening in Syria for 9 years now. We in the Middle East believe that it's all part of a scheme to destruct or undermine Arab countries and keep Israel standing on its feet alone.
Well, with respect, this is what I said about conspiracy theories. I don't think, even if the United States wanted to accomplish that, which I don't believe that it would be capable of achieving it. I mean, you didn't mention 9/11, of course. I live in New York. Almost 3,000 people were killed between New York and Washington. Yeah, no, I know that. I actually think going into Afghanistan was justified after 9/11. I think the huge, as a means to eliminate the presence of Al-Qaeda and undermine the Taliban or get rid of the Taliban. The great mistake was diverting 95% of America's military effort away from Afghanistan, which, in my view, was a justified war. I'm sure many of you disagree. To a war that was the grounds given for it proved to be false, and the war turned into a disaster. An erroneous decision was compounded by enormous incompetence, and here we are. The cost to the region has been enormous, devastating. The cost to the United States in treasure and lives has also been large, very large. And and the damage has been done. I don't believe it was the American intention to keep Israel dominant by these means. I think that could have been, if that was indeed the sinister intent, it could have been achieved way, way, way more economically. I think what you saw was you probably can't imagine the dimensions of the trauma of 9/11 to American society. A lot of what has happened since is attributable, in my view, to that trauma. The United States became completely disoriented. The United States sees itself as a sanctuary. It has oceans on either side of it. Aside from Pearl Harbor, nothing of this kind remotely resembling it had ever happened. And I think part of what you see in the United States today, and part of the explanation for Trump, is the trauma of 2001, 9/11, then compounded by the trauma of 2008, the financial meltdown, the Great Recession, millions of Americans losing their homes. These two things have proved very hard for the United States to recover from, and a lot of Americans, half of America went to war and half America went shopping, and a lot of people have been very angry, lost jobs, lost homes, lost savings, and you end up with a loony. But no, I don't believe in your theory.
Thank you, Roger, for your insights. If I may shift away from this topic,
Sure.
Can you share with us your thoughts about Western democracies? Are they that fragile, or can they rebound? You have touched on this subject
Small
in some of
subject.
your articles.
Well, I think we are seeing a crisis of Western democracies. Of course, the assumption when the Berlin Wall came down was that liberal democracies would simply and naturally spread across the world because communism had died. The assumption was that open markets, open societies were the rule of law, were the best basis for societies across the world. Of course, when you say things like the end of history, you're tempting fate. And I certainly didn't predict the resurgence of authoritarian models. We're seeing it within the European Union, in Hungary and Poland. We're seeing it in Russia, Vladimir Putin now saying he intends to rule until 2036, Xi Jinping declaring himself emperor for life, Bolsonaro, Donald Trump, with his and the model for achieving it is very clear: the use of technology to create surveillance states, the emasculation, as we've seen in Poland and Hungary by Orban and Kaczynski, of an independent judiciary, of a free press, placing business cronies in positions of influence. And I think the technology today is such that within a democracy, an emasculated democracy, you can hold, as Orban does, elections in which the outcome is already known, or as Putin does. So I do think it's a very dangerous moment for Western democracies. And when you have a US president who is not attached to that idea, and if anything seems to be far more comfortable, let's say, with a Mohammed bin Salman than he is with an Angela Merkel. A US president who, every time Xi or Putin extends his rule indefinitely, says, gosh, I wish I could do that. I mean, he says it half jokingly, maybe. But I think, there are very serious lawyers in Washington looking at what would happen or what to do if, as is quite plausible, this president says in November, if the vote hinges, on Wisconsin or Michigan or one state, he'll say, because in his mind, he cannot lose. In his mind, he's a genius. In his mind, his re-election is inevitable. He cannot admit of the possibility of defeat. So there are people looking very seriously at what measures would need to be taken to actually get him out of the White House. And if he's re-elected, I think it's also quite plausible that, like Mayor Bloomberg in New York, he might say, hey, I like this, I want another 4 years. So I think the equation changes if we return to a Joe Biden I think Biden is a problematic candidate. I mean, he's turning 78. My older daughter and son are in their 30s. They're absolutely not enthused by him. And I think everyone under 35, under 40 maybe, is really wondering. On the other hand, I said the other day, if the candidate against President Trump was a stuffed rabbit, I would vote for the stuffed rabbit. And I think there are a lot of people in the United States who, will vote for anyone. I'm not trying to compare Joe Biden to a stuffed rabbit, far from it. But, he has many, many qualities. Not least, I doff my hat to any man who can get over the loss of 2 of his children. I mean, that is really something pretty amazing. So I think the equation would change if you had an American president whose support for democracy was felt loudly and clearly across the world. I also think that dictatorships are inherently brittle, whereas democracies are, to some degree, inherently resilient. They take a long time to react sometimes, but when they do react, it's powerful. So, I'm certainly not ready to pronounce, the end of Western democracy. I mean, I think people are attached to their freedoms, and when they see what can happen in a repressive society, like the devastating concealment of a dangerous virus for a period of several weeks, much like the Soviet concealment of the disaster at Chernobyl, when open societies perceive what can happen. Sure, you can build an airport faster than you can build an airport in the West. You can build a highway in 5 seconds because you don't consult anyone. You can build railways. You can steal technology. You can disappear people you don't like. You can do all sorts of things that, maybe make people feel that their society is doing great. But if you're attached to freedom, if you're attached to agency, that word I use, if you're attached to being able to raise your voice to make a difference, and I think most of the world does in some way feel those attachments, then I can't be pessimistic about the future of democracy.
I have 1.5 questions. I'll start with the half.
Safwan, I think I'm about to lose my voice. So could we? Okay, fine. Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure.
As I said, I have 1.5 questions.
Right.
I'll start with the half question because it's been asked a little bit
Right.
earlier. Don't you think the liberals or the liberal centrists like yourselves or many amongst the liberals in the United States are a little bit too hard on Trump, considering the fact that there is no point of references that near us in the recent history of the United States when it comes to presidents? And I'll just give you an example. When it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to an Arabic guy like me or Libyan, I'm from Libya, so he's in his 2 years, and he's almost 4 years, hasn't really started a war in the Middle East. This is really astonishing. Mr. Obama started 2 wars, one of them destroying my country, Libya, and the second one, Syria. We're still dealing with it. He's deported 2 million Mexicans. I mean,
well, I think the war in Libya started within your country.
Yes, but this is a different opinion, 200 people went to Benghazi. It doesn't mean it's a war. So there's a different opinion in that, but NATO went in March.
As the conflict in Syria started within Syria. And it started
Again-
because of some of the things I've been talking about tonight. Because
Again,
you had a crazy dictator
Oh, yes, we
who
do.
wouldn't even let, when there was a football match on TV, none of the
This
players'
is-
names could be pronounced because
this
they
is-
might,
this is
anyway.
this is true,
Yeah.
but doesn't mean that the solution is NATO invading the country.
Yeah,
So I mean, revolutions
yeah,
have to
right.
have organic and have
Yeah,
to
yeah.
conclude. Changes have to be, but
Yeah.
that's a different story. I mean,
Yeah,
this is not
anyway,
my question, but
yeah.
we can discuss it some
Yeah,
other
yeah.
time. The second, I forgot the second question now. The second question is also related to Libya, and this is also related to the impact of United States policies around the world.
Yeah.
I mean, in 2014 we had an election. We had in 2012 an election, and the Americans ambassador came, and the liberals won about 75% of the votes, and the American ambassador came and said, no, we got to give the Muslim Brotherhoods equal footing in the parliament, and everybody was like, what? So this has happened, and I know people who are in the parliament who are saying that. So what you hear in the papers and New York Times and what you hear on TV when it comes to foreign policies in the Middle East or North Africa is not exactly what's happening. So how you can reconcile all this, like, you know?
Which ambassador are you referring to?
Dorothy, the lady, who,
Anyway,
she was the
to Libya?
Yeah. She went to the parliament when the liberals won 75%.
But after the murder of Chris Stevens, I don't think another ambassador was
Who?
appointed. After the murder of the killing of the American ambassador in Libya.
No, there was a lady in there. Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. Well, it's really all one question, I think, about, I mean, first of all, I'm sorry, I'm not going to tell you that in some ways Donald Trump is okay. I just don't believe that, and I will never believe that. He's not okay in any sense, and I fear that in the coming weeks in the United States, we could see just how devastating incompetence in the highest office in the land can be. In terms of Libya, I mean, again, I think I think it began internally, and Sarkozy led the way on the intervention, and the net result in Libya has been very bad. I don't think what pre-existed this was anything other than very bad as well. So I am not, I cannot say to you that I think President Trump has somehow been better because he's not started a war in the Middle East. He hasn't stopped a war either. I mean, look at Yemen, look at Syria, look at the consequences of the sudden withdrawal that Safwan talked about of American troops from northern Syria. Look at what he's done on Israel-Palestine. In many, many areas, his irresponsibility costs lives.
So,
Okay, thank you. Youth, at last.
exactly.
Okay, so you talked about how the withdrawal of the U.S. has negative effects because it has had good, the U.S. has tried to settle conflicts before, but doesn't the withdrawal of the U.S. also open up the door for a more international approach, for example, from the UN? To the conflicts. I mean, the UN also already does a lot, but doesn't that open the door for even more international commitment to the conflict?
Well, thank you for that question. I would say, in theory, perhaps. In practice, the UN being made up of more than 180 nations around the world, you inevitably tend to end up with the lowest common denominator, and the lowest common denominator is inaction. It's a little like Stalin's famous comment on the Vatican. How many divisions does the Pope have? How many divisions does the United Nations have? Well, it has blue-helmeted peacekeepers. I covered the war in Bosnia, and I saw a lot of blue-helmeted people hanging around in the middle of a conflict while women and children were being blown up in the streets of Sarajevo. I don't doubt the good intentions of those French soldiers and others, but the fact is that the United Nations is a beautiful idea and an important idea and a very important institution. But in terms of effectiveness in ending conflict, in resolving conflict, I don't think it is that. You might legitimately ask, what about the European Union? What about other actors? What about China and Russia? They're becoming, certainly China, a very important power in the world, and China is getting a little more involved in the Middle East. But right now, unfortunately, the European Union, which again is a lowest common denominator entity, right now, the departure of Britain from the European Union, the differences between the more the Polish, Hungarian, and other models that are going in a more autocratic direction, and the rest, the fact that the arrival of refugees has illustrated again that when it comes to the crunch, European solidarity tends to dissolve. I don't think the European Union is regarded as a credible actor in the region. It's respected, it passes measures, It's a little like at the outbreak of you're too young to remember this, but at the outbreak of the war in Bosnia, at least you certainly look like you are, at the outbreak of the war in Bosnia, Jacques Pons, the then foreign minister of Luxembourg, who was also then senior representative of the European Union, said very excitedly, the hour of Europe has come. And James Baker, then the Secretary of State, equally famously said, we don't have a dog in this fight. We don't have a dog in this fight. What happened in the end? Europe proved totally ineffective, and Richard Holbrooke, the US envoy, had to come into Sarajevo, where I'd been toiling away for a couple of years, and use American power to end that conflict. And again, going back to what I said earlier, was it a beautiful peace? No. Was it ugly in many ways? Yes. Were the aggressors rewarded? Yes. Has it proved a very unsatisfactory peace? Yes. But in those 25 years, not another shot has been fired in anger. Not another shot has been fired in anger. 100,000 people were killed while I was covering that war. Another 100,000 people are alive today because a very messy, difficult, painful compromise was reached in Dayton. And that, again, I say, Amos Oz was a friend of mine. He always said it, Yes, Israelis and Palestinians can get on fine, but first they have to have a divorce, and divorces are difficult. They're painful. You think husband and wife are both happy, when they walk out of a marriage? No, they're going to argue about the house, they're going to argue about the bank accounts, they're going to argue about, some are more amicable than others, but, the same is true. Whoever it is, all these issues, right of return, Jerusalem, every single settlements, every single issue is intensely painful and intensely felt. The only question for everybody involved is, what is better? To go on with this? It's been going on since 1948 and even before. Or to bite your lip and, smash your fists against the wall and go home and say, okay, we're going to try something different. We're going to try a really, really painful, difficult, unsatisfactory compromise. Well, you know what I feel, but it doesn't make any difference what I feel. Thank you. Thank you.